Well, that was a wrap of the headlines. Time now to zoom in on the latest on the African continent. This is Africa in View. Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa and several other African heads of state on the continent are currently in Equatorial Guinea to attend the 16th African Union Extraordinary Summit. The summit is focusing on terrorism and coups in Africa and comes on the back of growing insecurity, terrorism attacks by insurgencies and military coups in several countries. Political and humanitarian crises induced by terrorism will also be discussed, with collective measures to counter them hopefully achieved. For more on this, we're joined by the Research Chair for International Law at UJ, Dr. Christiano. Dr. D'Orsi, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us. I mean, firstly, just take us through the relevance of a summit like this. Why is it so important that we have our heads of state gathered together to discuss the expansion of terrorism on the continent?
Yes, madam. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was my pleasure to accept it. Yes, first of all, we have to say that this is an extraordinary meeting, that it's not only dealing with terrorism, but also with unconstitutional change of governments in Africa that unfortunately it still happen. But in any case, terrorism is the first argument on the floor, and simply because unfortunately terrorism is growing massively on the continent. According to the last global terrorism index that came out in March 2022, in Africa we assessed that almost the 50% of deaths last year because of terrorism. So it's becoming an increasing plight for the entire continent, for many countries on the entire continent, with a massive escalation in several regions, like in the Sahel, in Burkina Faso, for example, and in Mali, where also in Burkina Faso early this year we had a change of government with President Kabore, who couldn't manage, to thwart in a positive way the wave of terrorism in the country, and it was deposed by a military junta. So it's really something very topical. It's very timely at the moment. It's a huge plight, and so African presidents together in Malabo in Equatorial Guinea because they would like to find some not only some argument but also some measure to contrast the growing diffusion of terrorism throughout the continent.
You're right, Doctor, in highlighting the fact that the summit itself won't only be focusing on the expansion of terrorism on the continent, but this growing trend of coups taking place, the unconstitutional changes of government that we've been seeing. Now, we just very interestingly had a conversation with the French ambassador to South Africa. He was, of course, responding to some protest action that took place earlier this week, demanding an end to France's political interference on the continent. And I wonder if something like that, an idea or a notion like that, is something that will actually be discussed at the summit, the idea of Western countries and their influence on developments on the continent.
Well, if we speak about the development per se, of course, Africa, Western countries are still, their foot deeply set in the continent. That is a fact. If behind the unconstitutional change of governments there are Western countries, this is very hard to say, though, because of course, if this will happen, it would be uncovered. But if we just speak about how much Africa is still tied to European countries, and not only European, but let's say Western countries, for what is its development. Of course, there is nothing to debate on that because it's a fact. But of course, there are always rumors when there are some change, unconstitutional change in government, or the fact that, for example, some African presidents, they continue, to try to extend their term. They don't want elections. They try to remain in power, although constitution says that they should resign after two terms or 3 terms. This is something that is happening, and for example, this is a bit, the African Union as a champion for all this, for all the topic on the table, and this year champion for terrorism, for fight terrorism in Africa is Cameroonian President Paul Biya, who incidentally is on power in Cameroon since 1984. So you understand, there's a big contradictory that the topic on the table is terrorism, but also unconstitutional change of government, and the champion of terrorism is a contested president in his own country, in fact, like President Biya, that is on power for almost 40 years now. But these are several contradictions that may happen not only in Africa, though.
Dr. Orsi, I'd imagine that some of these contradictions is possibly why we have seen very little movement or change or, just results being yielded from some of the talks and counter-terrorism measures that we've been seeing on the continent. Because we know that just at a policy level, there are policies that have been put together to try and counter the expansion of terrorism on the continent. We know that there have also been deployments of troops in a number of missions to conflict-ridden areas that are dealing with insurgencies. So, but nonetheless, we are still seeing this growing expansion. We are seeing more and more hotspots, cropping up. Why is that? Is there an issue with some of the policies? What is the ineffectiveness about?
Well, it's true. Causes are various, of course. There's not only one cause. You just mentioned the deployment, of African troops, and we have a case very close geographically that it's what's happening now for almost 2 years in Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique, where is deployed the troop of the Southern African Development Councils, the SADC community, along with also Rwandan. There's always a mix of causes behind. There can be religion measures, economic measures, of course, like also happened in Cabo Delgado, where but most part of the time there are more reasons coming in together. People who feel, for example, to have been exploited, not to benefit from from the richness of that country, for example. It can be a cause that also can be corroborated by religious reasons, like the insurgence of Islamic terrorism that also apparently is also behind the insurgency in Cabo Delgado, but is also behind, as I mentioned before, in countries like in Burkina Faso, where for many years all religion, they were living together in peace, but it seems that Islamic terrorism is behind what's happening there, what's happening in Mali. We have the situation, the never resolved situation in Somalia, where also it's very difficult to find only one reason. But let's say that often, of course, there are economic reasons, corroborated often by religious reason, and sometimes also ethnic reason. Why not? Sometimes there are ethnic problems that have never been resolved, and often they're also, also the fault of this very, this very porous borders that many African countries have, putting together different ethnic groups that historically they didn't go along well with each other. So let's say, as everything, as all the war, there's not only one reason, but there are an ensemble of reasons that made the most to the growing diffusion of terrorism throughout the entire continent.
Sure. It certainly is a very complex matter that is going to be discussed during this 2-day summit. Yes. The other interesting thing, Dr. Orsi, is the fact that this is only the second high-level meeting of this nature to happen in the last 8 years. It does seem a little odd to have heads of state wait almost a decade to convene to discuss a pressing issue such as this, an issue that's bringing a lot of political instability to some of these countries. Should the Peace and Security Council be meeting on a much more regular basis so that they can get a proper handle on these developments in countries when it comes to unconstitutional changes in government, but also when it comes to the expansion of terrorism on the continent?
Well, yes, this is a good answer. In fact, let's say that it's been delayed for a long time, this second extraordinary meeting. But I would like to make clear one point, that Africa is really well aware of this plight of terrorism on the continent. And you know, the adoption, for example, of the 1999 Convention to Fight Terrorism, it has been the first regional convention in the world to try to thwart terrorism. So you see, 1999, it's almost, it's more than 20 years. So the continent, of course, is very aware. The issue is that really we had a very escalation in terrorism in Africa in the very last few years. But of course it's a plight that it's plaguing the continent for long. It's hopeful. In fact, we will see. Would be very interesting to see what will come out from this from this meeting. But I'm pretty sure that, unfortunately, the Peace and Security Council will be obliged to meet on a regular basis after today, because it will be one of the ways in which African countries can collaborate more in order to find a concrete solution that, of course, they have to elaborate. Although there is this critical, for example, lack of money that apparently prevent them to establish military forces a bit everywhere,
sure.
for example.
Sure.
Yes.
Very quickly, just in wrapping, Dr. Dorsi, when we're talking about expected outcomes, what should we hope to hear from the extraordinary summit? I mean, from the top of my head, I'd like to think greater cooperation from states in general across the continent will go a long way in helping to quell a lot of these issues. The AU has been criticized, heavily criticized, for not speaking up often enough when it comes to these unconstitutional changes in government. Perhaps a little bit more of that coming from the African Union. More sort of a resolved collective voice on issues around coups and terrorism on the continent.
Yes, well, of course, a major coordination for what's regarding terrorism is sought. But as I briefly mentioned, one of the problems is, I'm sorry but this is a chronic problem that generally affects many situations like this in the world, is the lack of finance that allows a real coordination in every single circumstance when it comes really to this issue. For what also is concerning the unconstitutional change of government, also that it's very, it's very political, right? And often these are considered in many instances, not only in Africa, problem of domestic affairs. So also supranational organizations like the African Union, sometimes it makes difficult to really find one voice, steady
sure.
voice, in order to condemn some change of government, because let's say that the terrorism and unconstitutional change of government, they are in a sense interrelated, but they're also topics they have to be dealt separately, because it's much more easier for the African Union to condemn the invasion of a region of a given country, like, as I said, it can be Cabo Delgado or northern Burkina Faso,
right,
or northern Cameroon, by terrorists. Other things is to condemn their own members, the politicians that regularly maybe they go to Addis Abeba or to other places to meetings.
Right.
It's very delicate situation there are two separate situations and very delicate to be dealt at the same issue, in fact.
Yes.
At the same level, yeah.
Indeed. A very delicate situation indeed, and it will be interesting to hear what, in fact, does come out of that extraordinary summit. But thank you so much for your time. That was Research Fellow, Lecturer, and South African Research Chair for International Law at the University of Johannesburg, Dr. Christiano de Orsi, helping us there to have the conversation around that extraordinary summit that is looking at issues around terrorism on the continent, as well as the unconstitutional changes in government.